In the last section, we added a very simplistic test just to make sure that our testing setup was working the way we had hoped. And it definitely is, which means we're now ready to add in a bunch more tests. That kind of puts us in the same situation that it seems like we are always in whenever we start writing tests. And that is, we have to start thinking about, what are we going to write tests for? Like, what are we trying to test here? Remember, I really advise you just sit down and think for a little bit about what behaviors you really care about inside of your code. Maybe something that we really care about is making sure that whenever we call create campaign right here, the person who is calling create campaign should be marked as the manager of the campaign that is created. So notice that accounts at 0 right here called create campaign. Because of that, I would expect this campaign instance should have accounts at 0 being marked as the manager. So maybe a good test to write right now would be something to just make sure that the manager of the campaign is accounts at 0. I think that'd be a pretty straightforward test to write. So let's give it a shot. Back down inside the describe block, I'll write out it marks caller as the campaign manager. In this case, when I say caller right here, I'm referencing the person who called create campaign on the factory. So I think that's a good description. We'll make sure we place our async keyword. As usual, do not forget that async, because we're definitely writing a lot of asynchronous code here. Then inside the it block, we have to think about exactly how we're going to do an assertion to make sure that the address for the manager is correctly set. I think that maybe we don't need to make this any more complicated than it is. Remember, we have access to our campaign instance right here. So if we call the manager method on the campaign, we can retrieve that address and then compare it against addresses at 0, or excuse me, accounts at 0. So let's give it a shot. I'll say const manager is await campaign.methods.manager.call. As usual, remember, whenever we make a public variable inside of our contract, a get method is automatically created. So you and I did not make a method called manager. This was automatically created for us because we had marked the manager variable as being public. So here's our campaign. Here's the manager. It is of type address, and it is a public variable. So that's why we have access to this method. And then, of course, as usual, we are not modifying any data here. We are just retrieving the variable. And for that, we do a call as opposed to a send. So underneath this, after we retrieve the address of the manager, we can then compare it against accounts at 0. So I will assert equal, and we're going to write out what we want it to be, or what we hope it is, and what it actually is as the second argument. So let's save this and run our tests again. Back at the command line, we'll do npm run test. And after a brief pause, we have 2 tests passing. Very good. All right, well, that's definitely a good start. Well, that one came together pretty quickly, so let's continue on to writing our next test right away. Again, I want to think about what behavior I really care about for our contract. Maybe we should test to make sure that people are able to donate money to our campaign and thus become a contributor. So maybe we should use another account to donate some money to the campaign or contribute some money to the campaign. Then we can somehow check to see if that account or that address gets marked as an approver inside of our contract. I think that the first part of this test will be pretty obvious. We'll call the contribute method, we'll send in some amount of money, and we'll make sure that we are sending it from some specific accounts from our accounts array right here. After that, we could then figure out exactly how we check to make sure that that person is marked as an approver. We'll get to that part. All right, so let's make another it block down here. So I'll say it allows people to contribute money and marks them as approvers. Don't forget to place the async keyword. I really can't say that enough. And then inside the it block, we can start writing out our method to attempt to contribute some amount of money to our campaign. So we'll say await campaign.methods.contribute. Remember that contribute does not take any arguments to it. Instead, we specify a value to send along with a transaction. Also recall that we have some minimum contribution level. For this campaign, we had set up a minimum contribution of 100. So we just need to make sure that we send in more than 100 way. All right, so we'll call it contribute.send. We'll specify a value of, how about just 200? That's totally fine. And then we also need to specify who is sending this transaction. So this is going to be the account that gets marked as the contributor or the approver. So we'll do from, how about accounts at 1. Remember that the accounts array is created for us by Ganache, and by default we get 10 different accounts generated. So this is just account number 2. Remember, 1 is the index. The first account is at index 0. So this is account 2 of 10 that we can make use of. This should definitely get us marked as a contributor, but now we need to figure out exactly how we make sure that the contract now considers us to be a contributor. This part's going to be a little bit more challenging. Let's go back and look at our contract source and see if there isn't some way that we can verify that this account address right here is considered to be an approver or a contributor. So back inside my contract source, I'll scroll on down to the campaign. Remember the data structure that we had used for keeping track of who is a approver. We went through all that long discussion about how we wanted to use a mapping for that, because mappings have constant time lookup, and it doesn't matter how many approvers we have, it'll always take the same amount of time to verify that someone is an approver. Also notice that we marked approvers as a public variable. So because we marked this as public, we do in fact get a method to access this mapping. If we call this approvers variable as a method or as a function in the exact same way that we did just a moment ago, like with manager right here, we don't get back the entire mapping. So we don't retrieve the entire mapping. Instead, what we can do is look up a single value in the mapping. In other words, if we call the approvers function that gets generated for us, because this is a public variable, and pass in the address that we want to look up, it will return a Boolean, either true or false. And so as we have set up our contract, we have said that if you put in an address and the mapping returns a Boolean of true, then you are considered to be an approver. So long story short, if we call the method approvers that gets automatically generated for us and pass in accounts at 1 as an argument, we should get back a value of true. And we can do that to verify that after calling contribute, accounts at 1 is marked as an approver. All right, so let's give that a shot. I'm going to say const is contributor equals await campaign.methods.approvers. So again, remember, this is the mapping. Well, more specifically, this is the function that allows us to access that mapping. We cannot retrieve an entire mapping, just does not exist. Instead, we can only retrieve or look up single values from it. So we need to pass in a key, and then this thing will retrieve or will return the value that corresponds to that key. So in this case, I want to see if there is a value associated with accounts at 1. So for the first set of parentheses, I'm going to pass in accounts at 1, like so. Now, as usual, we are doing data lookup here. We are not modifying any data, so we're going to tack on a .call, like so. All right, so is contributor should end up being a Boolean value, either true or false. So with that in mind, we can do a simple assert, and I'm going to assert is contributor. Remember that assert will fail if we pass in a falsy value right here. So if is contributor is true, the test is going to pass. Otherwise, this thing is going to fail. All right, let's save this contract file, or this test file, excuse me, and run it from the command line. So I'm going to change back over. We'll do npm run test. We'll wait a moment or two, of course. And sure enough, it looks like it actually passed. Very good. All right, so I think that's 2 additional tests that definitely add some value to our contract. Let's take a pause now, and we'll continue in the next section with a couple more tests.